The morning Evelyn Sutton stepped off the stagecoach in Harrow Creek, Wyoming territory, in the spring of 1882, she was wearing her best dress, carrying a carpet bag with everything she owned, and prepared to become a wife. What she was not prepared for was the fact that her new home was a canvas tent staked into the dry earth behind a half-built lumber frame. She stood at the edge of the dusty main street and blinked once, slowly, the way a woman blinks when she is deciding whether to cry or to laugh, or to pick up her skirts and walk straight back to the stagecoach before it rolled away. The driver had already clicked at the horses, and the wheels were already turning, and that particular option dissolved into a cloud of alkaline dust before she had finished blinking. She had come from St. Louis, Missouri, answering an advertisement placed in the Missouri Republican by one Elias Langston, rancher, age 28, who sought a capable and honest woman of good character willing to settle on the Wyoming frontier. The advertisement had been precise in its language. It had mentioned land, cattle, a house under construction, and the promise of a partnership built on mutual respect and hard work. It had not, in any way, mentioned a tent. Evelyn was 24 years old. She had auburn hair the color of old copper pulled into a practical knot at the nape of her neck, and brown eyes that were quick and clear and missed very little. She had grown up the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress in St. Louis, and she had learned to read ledgers and mend leather harnesses and bake bread that did not break teeth. And she had determined that the frontier was a better gamble than another decade of genteel poverty in a city that smelled of river mud and coal smoke. She was not the sort of woman who broke easily, but the tent was a surprise. It was a large wall tent. She would give it that much the kind the Army used, with wooden side boards and a stove pipe punched through the canvas ceiling. Someone had arranged a wooden door frame at the entrance, though the door itself had not yet been hung, and a cotton curtain served as barrier between inside and whatever passed for outside in Harrow Creek, Wyoming in the middle of April, when the wind came off the Laramie Range cold enough to make a person's eyes water. She was still standing with her carpet bag and looking at the tent when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. "Miss Sutton." The voice was low and careful, the voice of a man accustomed to speaking clearly over wind and distance. She turned. He was taller than she had imagined from his letters, broad through the shoulder in a way that suggested genuine labor rather than mere size, and he wore a dark canvas coat over a flannel shirt the color of a winter sky. His hat was weathered brown felt with a sweat-stained band, pushed back from a face that was sun-browned and angular, and carrying the kind of expression she could only describe as braced, the expression of a man who knows a difficult conversation is coming and has decided to meet it standing up. He was, by any reasonable measurement, quite handsome, though Evelyn was careful not to notice that before she had addressed the matter of the tent. "Mr. Langston," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had expected, "I believe you have some explaining to do." Elias Langston removed his hat with both hands and held it at his chest, which she recognized immediately as a sincere gesture rather than a practiced one. He had dark hair, a little long at the collar, and gray eyes that were watching her with an intensity that was not impolite but was certainly thorough. "The house was supposed to be finished in February," he said. "There was a problem with the timber order. The freight company out of Cheyenne made an error and sent half the lumber to a claim in Colorado, and by the time it was sorted out, I had already written to confirm your arrival, and I made a decision not to postpone the arrangement because—" He stopped. He looked at the tent and then back at her. "I made an error in judgment," he said simply. "The house is started and it is solid, and I have materials arriving next week, and I can have it habitable within a month if I work steady, and I understand completely if you— Do you have a hammer?" Evelyn said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon. A hammer, Mr. Langston, and nails, I should hope. And if you have any spare lumber boards that are not spoken for by the house, I would like them." He stared at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite name, something that was not quite confusion and not quite wonder but lived in the neighborhood of both. "I do," he said slowly. "Then show me where they are," she said, and picked up her carpet bag, "and show me the tent and let us figure out what needs doing first." He put his hat back on his head and led her across the dirt of Harrow Creek's Main Street, which consisted of a general store, a land office, a saloon called the Copper Spur, a livery stable, and a small building that functioned as both post office and barber shop. It was not St. Louis. It was barely a town. But the mountains to the west were enormous and clean against the blue sky, and the grass in the valley below was that particular shade of early spring green that made the world look like it was only just beginning. And Evelyn found that she could breathe out here in a way she never quite could in the city. The tent was pitched on a level piece of ground about 200 yards behind the main street, at the edge of Elias Langston's land claim. The lumber frame of the future house rose perhaps 4 feet from the foundation stones, skeletal and promising. There were tools organized along the north side of the frame in a way that demonstrated genuine care, nothing rusting, everything stored with intention. Elias lifted the curtain that served as the tent's door, and she stepped inside. It was more livable than she had feared. There was a small iron stove against the back wall, cold now but clearly functional. There was a narrow rope bed with a wool blanket folded across it, a wooden packing crate that served as a table, and a second crate pressed into service as a seat. Hanging from the central ridge pole was a lantern. Along one side wall, someone had driven wooden pegs into a cross board, and on those pegs hung a coat, a spare shirt, and a coiled rope. There were 2 tin cups and a tin coffee pot on the stove. There were no flowers, no curtains, no softness of any kind, and it smelled of canvas and cold ash and the clean mineral scent of Wyoming soil. Evelyn set her carpet bag on the crate table and turned in a slow circle. "You have been sleeping here yourself," she said. "Since November," Elias confirmed. He was standing just inside the curtain, watching her carefully, still with that braced quality. "I sold the room at the boarding house to put the money toward materials." Something in her chest shifted slightly, some recognition of the kind of sacrifice that did not advertise itself. "There is no door on the frame," she said. "No. And the wind comes from the north at night." "Mostly, yes." She examined the curtain. It was heavy cotton, double thickness, but cotton was cotton, and Wyoming at night in April was not gentle. "I need 2 boards," she said. "One for the door frame to hang a proper door on, and one to build a windbreak on the north side of the tent. Do you have a door blank, or will we need to build one from planks?" There was a pause. When she looked back at him, that expression was on his face again, the one she could not name, except that now it was clearer, and she thought, though she was not certain, that it might have something to do with relief. "I have a door blank in the supply stack," he said. "Intended for the house, but I can reorder." "No, we will use what is here and reorder for the house," she said. "Show me the tool kit." He showed her. It was a good kit. A solid claw hammer with a hickory handle, a hand saw, a drawknife, a brace and bit, a level, a chalk line, and several assorted chisels. There were also hinges, iron hardware, and a box of cut nails in various sizes. Evelyn picked up the hammer, turned it in her hand, felt its balance. In St. Louis, her father had built the family's back porch himself, and she had spent many a Saturday afternoon on her knees hammering boards while her mother disapproved from the kitchen doorway, and her father told her that knowing how things were put together was the most useful knowledge a person could carry. She had never imagined she would be grateful for it in quite this way. "Right," she said. "The door goes on first because the cold is coming in and there is no sense working in wind that could be stopped. Then the windbreak on the north side. Then we will see about making this livable while you work on the house." Elias looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the open door frame and falling across the side of his face, and he had very fine bones beneath the weathered skin, she noticed, the kind of face that would still be interesting when he was old. "Miss Sutton," he said, "I am sorry about the tent. You deserve better than what I am offering right now, and I want you to know I intend to make it right. Mr. Langston, she said, I intend to make it right myself. Now are you going to help me hang this door, or are you going to stand there looking sorry? She thought she saw the corner of his mouth move. Not quite a smile. Close. I will get the door blank, he said. They worked through the morning together. She held the door frame plumb while he measured and marked, and she drilled pilot holes with the brace and bit while he fitted the hinges. And when she drove the first nail with a clean single swing that sank it flush on the first strike, she heard a small sound from him that might have been a laugh quickly swallowed. Most men can't do that in one, he said. My father believed in doing things properly, she said, and drove the next nail. He watched her hands. She noticed without acknowledging it. By the time the door was hung and swinging cleanly on its new hinges, the sun had climbed to its mid-morning position and the air had warmed slightly. Evelyn stepped back and pushed the door open and pulled it closed, testing the swing, and found it sound. Elias stood beside her. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool air, and she was carefully aware of this and equally careful not to show it. Good door, he said. It is, she agreed. Now the windbreak. They hauled 3 boards from the lumber stack, and Elias dug posts, while she sorted the boards and checked them for warping. The rancher who was working the adjacent claim, a bearded man named Luther Kane, who had observed their morning's work from a respectful distance, eventually ambled over and offered to hold the boards while they were nailed in place, and Evelyn thanked him without ceremony and handed him one end of the longest plank. Luther Kane was in his 40s and had a wife in Nebraska he spoke of constantly, and a manner that was entirely without guile. He looked at Elias over the top of Evelyn's head with an expression of frank amazement. Where did you find this woman? He said. Missouri, Elias said, without looking up from the nail he was setting. You ought to hold on to her, Luther said. I intend to, Elias said, and then appeared to become very absorbed in the hammer. Evelyn drove the last nail home and said nothing, but she felt the heat rise in her face and was glad the Wyoming wind was there to account for it. It was 1:45 when they finished the windbreak and stood back to assess their work. The north wall of the tent now had a solid board baffle of 4 feet, enough to redirect the worst of the wind and keep the canvas from rattling like a drum in the night. The door was hung. The space, while still a tent, felt markedly more like a dwelling. Elias had been watching her all morning in that quiet, thorough way, and she had been watching him back, equally quietly, and what she had observed was this. He was not a man who wasted motion. Every task he undertook was done with complete attention, and when she said a thing once, he understood it, and he did not attempt to take the hammer from her hands or explain how he thought it ought to be done differently. He worked beside her the way a person works beside someone they respect, and Evelyn Sutton, who had spent years in St. Louis being gently informed that a woman's opinions on construction were decorative at best, found this nearly as startling as the tent had been. She also noticed that when he reached across her to set a plank and his arm came close to her shoulder, he said "Pardon me" in a very low and deliberate way, and his eyes, when they met hers for a moment, were warm. She turned her attention back to the hammer. I should start the coffee, she said. I assume you have a morning meal still ahead of you. I generally eat when the work is done, he said. The work is never done on a claim like this, she said. You should eat on a schedule or you will wear down before the house is standing. Do you have salt pork and cornmeal? In the supply box, yes. Then I will make a meal and you will eat it, and then you will tell me the full state of the house construction and what needs to happen in what order. He took a breath and released it slowly. Miss Sutton, he said. Evelyn, she said, without thinking about it, and then did think about it and held her ground on it. We are to be married, and Miss Sutton is a great deal of formality for a woman who has just spent 3 hours helping you build a windbreak. Something moved across his face then, something quick and genuine and unguarded. Evelyn, he said, and the way he said it was careful as though the word mattered. I am very glad you came. She nodded once. "Start the fire in that stove," she said. "The morning is getting warm, but the coffee pot is cold, and I think better with coffee." He smiled, then actually smiled, and it changed his entire face, opened it up, put lines at the corners of his gray eyes, made him look suddenly younger and less braced for difficulty. And Evelyn Sutton walked into the tent and reached into her carpet bag for the small tin of coffee she had packed in St. Louis because she had not known what to expect at the frontier and had decided to be prepared for anything. And she stood very still for a moment with her hand on the tin and thought to herself that this was going to be something considerably more interesting than she had anticipated. She had not anticipated the way he smiled. She had not anticipated being glad. Elias built the fire and she made the coffee and fried the salt pork with cornmeal in the cast iron pan that was the tent's one luxury. And they sat on the crate seats outside the tent in the spring sunshine, because the tent was too small for two people to sit at the same time without being very close indeed. And they ate and drank their coffee, and he told her about the house. It was going to be a proper house. 2 rooms downstairs, a main room that would serve as kitchen and sitting room both, and a smaller room that could be a bedroom or an office or whatever was needed. And a sleeping loft above that was accessible by a fixed ladder and had a small window facing east. He had a cistern dug and a pump ordered from Cheyenne. He intended a kitchen garden on the south side of the house where the soil was good and the sun came in longest. He had 40 head of cattle on a shared grazing range with 2 other ranchers in the valley, and the herd was healthy and increasing. Evelyn listened to all of this and asked clear, practical questions about the cistern depth and the roofline pitch, and how he intended to weatherproof the loft window against the winter. And he answered each question with the same direct completeness, without condescension, without impatience, and gradually, over the course of that first meal together in the spring sunshine of Wyoming, the braced quality went out of his shoulders and he sat differently, more settled, more himself. She found herself wanting to know what he looked like when he was all the way himself, without any bracing at all. "You said in your letters you had been a soldier," she said. "Briefly," he said. 3 years cavalry in the early 70s. I was out by 73. "You do not talk about it the way men usually talk about the war," she said. "Different war," he said, "and not one I am proud of on the whole." He looked out at the mountains. The Army's work in this territory in those years was not the kind of thing a man ought to brag about. He was quiet for a moment. People were living here, families. They had been living here a long time. The Army moved them off and called it progress. He turned the tin cup in his hands. "I finished my service, and I took my land warrant, and I came out here, and I bought this claim fair from the territory office, and I intend to work it fair. That is the most I can say for myself." She looked at him steadily. "It is more than some can say. It is not enough," he said simply, "but it is what I can do from where I stand." She respected this more than she expected to, the plainness of it, the absence of either self-congratulation or excessive guilt. He had looked at a thing he had been part of, judged it honestly, and determined a course going forward. That was not nothing. That was actually quite a great deal. "My father taught school," she said. "He taught freedmen's children in St. Louis in the years after the war. The city did not always make that easy for him." "Was he a good teacher?" Elias asked. "The best I ever knew," she said. "He died of influenza 2 years ago, my mother the year before that." "I am sorry," he said, and it was not the automatic sorry of social convention. It was attended to. "They were good people," she said. "I miss them. But they raised me to be capable of taking care of myself, and I think they would have considered that the whole point." She set down her coffee. "Which is why I am here instead of in St. Louis taking in mending to make ends meet." He was looking at her with that quality again, the thorough attention, and she met it directly. "I want to be honest with you," he said, "about what I put in the advertisement and what is actually here." "Please," she said. "The land is good," he said. "That is true and real. The cattle are healthy, that is true. The house will be built, that is certain, I give you my word on it. But it is harder here than the advertisement made it sound, and lonelier, and there are months when the supply freight does not come through because of weather and you eat what you have. There are ranchers in the valley who have been friendly, but the town is small and there is not much society. The nearest proper town is Laramie, and that is a day's ride. He paused. I put a good face on things in that advertisement because I wanted someone to come, and I am ashamed of it now, sitting here across from you. You did not lie, she said. I let the truth breathe more than it needed to, he said. She considered this. The house under construction, she said. That was true. The land and cattle were true. You said a partnership built on mutual respect and hard work. I meant that one completely, he said. I know you did, she said. I could tell it in the letters. There are men who write to women like me, and everything they write is performance. Every word is designed to present an image rather than a person. Your letters were not like that. She looked at him. I came because you wrote like someone I could actually trust. The gray eyes held hers for a moment that stretched a beat past comfortable. I will try to deserve that, he said. You already are, she said, and stood up to take the tin plates back inside, and he sat in the spring sunshine for a moment looking at the mountains, and the wind moved across the new grass in the valley below with a sound like water. There was a practical matter that needed addressing before any question of romance could proceed with any dignity, and that was the matter of sleeping arrangements in a single-room tent. Elias solved this with characteristic directness. He found a second canvas panel in the supply store, strung a rope across the width of the tent, and hung the canvas from it to divide the space into two portions, giving Evelyn the section with the rope bed and the stove, and constructing for himself a narrow sleeping place on the far side with a bedroll and a folded horse blanket. He did this without being asked and without discussion, and when Evelyn came back from the general store, where she had introduced herself to the proprietor, a round-faced man named Hiram Wells who had been visibly astonished to meet her, she found the canvas partition in place, and her carpet bag moved to the side of the tent with the bed. She stood in the divided tent for a long moment. He had left a wooden peg on her side for hanging things, and had moved the second tin cup to a small board shelf above the stove that she had not noticed that morning. She unpacked her carpet bag, which contained 2 dresses besides the one she wore, a wool shawl, a Bible that had been her mother's, a slim volume of poems by Emily Dickinson, a small sewing kit in a tortoiseshell case, her father's penknife, 3 pairs of stockings, a comb, a looking glass no bigger than her palm, the tin of coffee she had already deployed, a packet of seeds she had known about the frontier, at least in theory, and $43 in paper money folded inside the Bible's cover. She hung the 2 dresses on the wooden peg, set the Bible and the poetry on the shelf above the stove, and put the sewing kit and the looking glass on the crate table. She opened the packet of seeds and examined them: spinach, radish, bean, and carrot. They would go in the ground before the week was out. She found herself thinking, against her better judgment, about the way Elias Langston's hands looked when they held a hammer. They were large hands, scarred in the way of working hands, and they moved with precision and patience, and this was entirely irrelevant to the matter of seeds, but she thought it anyway. The following day, Evelyn walked to the general store with a list and introduced herself properly to Hiram Wells and his wife, Marta, a comfortable woman in her 50s with knowing eyes and a forthright manner. Marta Wells was the closest thing Harrow Creek had to a social center, and she received Evelyn with the slightly anxious delight of a woman who had spent several years as the only wife in a 3-mile radius and was deeply glad to have a companion. He is a good man, Elias Langston, Marta said, as she weighed out flour behind the counter. Pays his accounts, helps neighbors, does not drink to excess or play cards for money he does not have. We worried some when he advertised for a bride because we did not know what manner of woman would come and whether she would suit. She looked at Evelyn with frank assessment. You suit. Thank you, Evelyn said. He has been working himself near to breaking these last months trying to get that house up in time, Marta said. Would not ask for help, which is the one irritating quality in him. Too proud to admit when he is short-handed. I have noticed that, Evelyn said. Perhaps you will do something about it, Marta said, with the satisfied expression of a woman planting a seed. When Evelyn returned to the claim that afternoon with her supply purchases balanced in a canvas sack, she found Elias on the house frame, setting a horizontal beam alone, which required 3 people under normal circumstances. He was managing it with a system of rope and bracing blocks that was technically functional and practically dangerous. She put the supplies inside the tent and walked to the frame. "Luther Kane," she called up to him. "Does he have work this afternoon?" Elias looked down from the beam. "He mentioned his fence mending was done." "Then I'm going to go ask him to come help," she said. "And Hiram Wells said there is a young man who does day labor, a boy named Thomas." "He is 17, Elias said. "Then he is old enough to hold the other end of a beam," she said. "I can manage," Elias said. "You can also fall," she said, looking at the rope arrangement with the expression her mother had reserved for bad ideas. "And then there will be no one to build the house at all, and I will be living in this tent considerably longer than a month, which I am not willing to do." He looked at her for a moment from his position on the frame. "Are you always this direct?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Is that a problem?" The corner of his mouth moved. "No," he said. "It is actually no." "Go ahead and ask Luther." Luther Kane came, and Thomas Miller came 18. She had been misinformed, and with 4 people working the house frame went up with a speed that visibly surprised Elias, who was accustomed to solving every problem alone. By the end of the second day, all 4 exterior walls were framed to their full height, and the ridge beam was in place. In the evenings, after the work was done and Luther had gone home to his own tent, his wife in Nebraska had written to say she was coming in July, which Luther celebrated by cooking an enormous and terrible meal that he shared with everyone. Evelyn and Elias sat outside the tent on 2 boards placed across sawhorses that served as a bench, and they talked. This was the part she had not expected and had not prepared for, the talking. The way it came easy and went long after the sun went down, and the stars appeared in the enormous Wyoming sky with a density that was nothing like the sky over St. Louis. She had not expected to enjoy his company quite so much, or to find herself looking forward to the end of the workday for reasons that had nothing to do with rest. He had been to places she had not. Texas, New Mexico, the Indian Territory that would one day be Oklahoma, the edge of the southern plains. He had seen things she had only read about, and he told them plainly and without embellishment. And when she told him things in return, he listened with the same thorough attention he gave everything. And she found that she was telling him things she had not told anyone, about her father's school, and the nights they had sat up by lamplight while he graded papers, and she read beside him, about the particular freedom of the public library in St. Louis and how she had read her way through 3 entire rows of shelves in the years after her parents died, about the decision to answer his advertisement, how it had felt like stepping off a cliff and choosing to believe the ground was closer than it appeared. "Were you frightened?" he asked, one evening about a week after she had arrived. "Of what specifically?" she asked. "Of coming here," he said, "not knowing what you would find." She considered being diplomatic and decided against it. "Yes," she said. "On the stagecoach from Laramie, I was terrified. I kept thinking about every way it might be wrong, that you might be nothing like the letters, that the land might be uninhabitable, that I had made an enormous error. And when you arrived," he said. "When I arrived," she said carefully, "I found a tent which was alarming and a man who looked like he was bracing for the worst and trying not to show it, and a very good set of tools." She paused. "And the mountains." He looked at the mountains now, black shapes against the star-filled dark. "The mountains helped," he said, and there was something in his voice she could not quite read. "They made it feel like it was worth the risk," she said honestly. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You helped too, with the mountains, I mean, the way you looked at them when you got off the stagecoach." He cleared his throat. "I was watching from the boardwalk before you saw me." She looked at him. "What was I doing?" "Just looking," he said. Like you were making a decision, like you were deciding they were enough. He paused. I thought if she can look at this place and decide it is enough, maybe I have not done something completely wrong by bringing her here. The night had gone very quiet around them. Just the wind in the grass and the distant sound of the creek that ran along the valley's edge. Elias, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without deliberate thought, and she felt it when it left her lips, felt the particular weight of it. He turned to look at her in the darkness. I think, she said, that you wrote to me honestly enough that I could trust the mountains, she said, and the tools and the rest. His breath came out slowly. I am glad you did, he said. They sat in the dark for another hour, not always talking, sometimes just listening to the night. And when she went inside the tent, she lay awake for a long time on the rope bed with the wool blanket pulled up and listened to the Wyoming stars doing whatever stars do, and thought about gray eyes and the weight of a hammer in a hand that knew what it was doing. The circuit preacher came through Harrow Creek on the 15th of April, a lean, dry man named Reverend Caleb Marsh, who traveled the eastern Wyoming circuit on a mule and performed baptisms, funerals, and weddings with equal efficiency and not much sentiment. He had a practical theology suited to a landscape that did not waste resources on the ornamental. It was not the wedding Evelyn had imagined as a girl. But then, the life she was building was not the life she had imagined as a girl, and she had decided some time in the previous 2 years that this was not a loss but a correction, a recalibration toward something truer and better suited to who she actually was. Marta Wells stood as her witness and brought flowers from the small pot of cultivated plants she kept in her store window. Luther Kane stood for Elias, and Thomas Miller, the young day laborer who had become a semi-permanent presence on the house construction, held the horses and watched the proceedings with the earnest attention of someone observing a historical event. Reverend Marsh read the vows in a voice that carried efficiently across the open air, and when he came to the part where Elias was to speak, Elias turned to face Evelyn fully and held her hands in both of his and looked at her with those gray eyes that missed nothing. And he said the words as if he meant every one of them, as if he were making a real promise rather than repeating a formula, and Evelyn heard her own voice come out equally clear and true. When Reverend Marsh said, "You may kiss your bride," Elias Langston bent his head and pressed his lips to hers, briefly and gently, and she felt the warmth of it all the way to her boot soles. And when he pulled back, there was a look on his face so unguarded and so new that she had to look away for a moment at the mountains, steadying herself before she could look back. Marta Wells cried. Luther Kane shook Elias' hand vigorously, and then, apparently deciding this was insufficient, embraced him with a force that made Elias stagger slightly. Reverend Marsh ate supper with them, complimented the cornbread, and was on his mule and moving by sundown because he had a baptism in Elk Valley on Sunday and it was a long ride. That night, with the canvas partition taken down, there was only one side to the tent. Evelyn sat on the edge of the rope bed and looked at the stove, which was lit and casting warm light across the canvas walls. And she was not afraid exactly, but she was aware of herself with a kind of heightened attention, aware of the sound of his breathing on the other side of the tent and the creak of the floor boards he had put down over the dirt. He knocked on the door frame. He always knocked on the door frame, even when the door was open, and came in. "I wanted to say," he started and stopped. He was holding his hat again, a habit she had learned meant he was being careful. "I wanted to say that you do not have to feel rushed about anything. I know this has all moved very quickly and I want you to be comfortable." He met her eyes. "We have time." She looked at him steadily and felt the careful honesty of this, the deliberateness of it, the respect in it. "I know," she said. "Come to bed, Elias. We have a house to build tomorrow and an early start is better." He hung his hat on the peg and she moved the lantern to make room, and the tent was warm with the stove's fire, and outside the Wyoming stars turned overhead in their ancient patterns, and it was enough, more than enough. The house went up board by board through the last 2 weeks of April and into May. Thomas Miller proved to be a tireless and cheerful worker who had arrived in Wyoming from Georgia the previous fall with very little money and no particular plan, and who had found in the Langstons an employer and, in short order, something closer to a family. He was a long-limbed young man of 18 with a quick laugh and a genuine talent for joinery that emerged gradually as the construction progressed, and that Elias recognized and encouraged in a way that visibly meant a great deal to Thomas. He had come from the South in the specific manner of a young man who could not stay where he was. He did not elaborate on this, and Elias and Evelyn did not press, but the particular quality of his relief at being in Wyoming, at being given a fair wage and spoken to with ordinary respect, suggested a history that the frontier, for all its considerable hardships, had improved upon. Evelyn found work during the construction days that was not the same as the men's heavy framing work, but was no less necessary. She kept the supply accounts in a small ledger she had purchased from Hiram Wells, ensuring that the timber order was correct, and the nail supply adequate, and the food stores sufficient for 3 hardworking people, and the occasional appearance of Luther Kane. She also began the kitchen garden on the south side of the house, which at this stage was only a cleared and turned patch of earth with stakes and string marking the rows, but which she tended with a kind of fierce satisfaction. She planted the seeds from her carpet bag packet the spinach and radish that would come first, and the bean and carrot for later, and she acquired additional seeds from Marta Wells and put in a row of potatoes and a row of onions, and she found, kneeling in the spring soil of Wyoming with the sun warm on her back and the frame of her new house rising just to the north, that something in her that had been held in a kind of suspension for 2 difficult years had finally come down, gently, into place. She was home. The realization was so simple and so complete that it arrived without drama, just as a fact, like the weight of the good Wyoming earth in her hands. The day the roof went on, Elias came down from the rafters at noon to find Evelyn and Marta Wells in the kitchen area, with a pot of actual vegetable soup over the newly installed kitchen stove, a proper range that had come from the Cheyenne freight on Tuesday, a beautiful, heavy, black iron thing with 6 plates and a warming shelf, and the smell of that soup in the first real room of the first real house was something that stopped him in the doorway for a moment. He had his tool belt on and sawdust in his hair, and a nail scratch across the back of his left hand from the morning's work, and he stood in the doorway of his house and looked at the soup pot, and the woman stirring it, and the afternoon light coming through the new window glass on the south wall, and something in his chest did what chests do when they are confronted by the full weight of a moment they had stopped believing was coming. Evelyn looked up from the soup pot and saw him standing there. "Wash your hands before you sit down," she said. "There is water in the bucket by the door." He washed his hands. He ate 2 bowls of the soup and did not say very much and looked at the window glass, through which the kitchen garden was just visible, the new stakes and string and the first faint pale green of spinach coming up. After the meal, when Marta had gone and Thomas was back on the roof and the kitchen was quiet, Elias found Evelyn at the garden, kneeling over the spinach row with a small trowel. "The spinach is coming up," she said, without looking up. "Look at these." She pointed at the thread-thin first sprouts pushing through the soil, which were so new and tentative they were barely there. He crouched beside her and looked at the sprouts. "I have not had a proper garden since I left my mother's house in Ohio," he said. 1871. 11 years, she said. 11 years, he confirmed. They were both crouching in the kitchen garden looking at sprouts that were barely the width of a hair, and it was one of the least impressive sights available on the Wyoming frontier, and it was nevertheless the best moment of Elias Langston's adult life. He reached out and touched the soil very lightly beside the nearest sprout, not touching the plant, just the earth around it, the way you might touch something you were afraid of disturbing. Evelyn was very close. He could see the copper strands in her hair where they had come loose from the knot at her neck, moving in the light breeze. He could see the small scar on her right hand from the nail she had caught on the windbreak building day. He had been watching her for 4 weeks, and he knew the shape of her hands better than he had known anything in a long time, the economy of their movement, the certainty in them. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. They were at eye level, both of them crouching, and she was close enough that he could see the amber flecks in her brown eyes and the faint dust on her cheekbone and the tiny smile that was beginning at the corner of her mouth. "I know," she said. "I have not said anything yet," he said. "You were going to say something about how glad you are," she said. "You have been working up to it for a week and a half." He stared at her. "Is it that obvious?" "To me," she said simply. "Yes." "And what would you say," he said carefully, "if I said it?" She looked at him with those clear brown eyes that missed nothing, and she set the trowel down in the soil very deliberately, and she said, "I would say that I came here in April not knowing what I would find, and I found a tent and a hammer and a man who knocked on the door frame even when the door was open, and I think I would like to stay for a very long time." He reached out and took her hand, the one with the small nail-scratch scar, and held it in both of his, and she let him, and they crouched in the kitchen garden in the Wyoming afternoon with the first spinach coming up around them, and he said, "I love you," with the same plainness he gave everything true, and it was not flowery and it was not performed, and it was the most real thing he had ever said out loud. "I love you too," she said, and meant it in the same complete and practical and bone-deep way, and leaned forward and kissed him first, which surprised him briefly before he kissed her back, properly this time, in the afternoon sunshine with the spinach coming up and the mountains watching the whole affair with characteristic indifference. The house was finished at the end of May, 10 days ahead of Elias' revised estimate, owing to the combined efforts of Thomas Miller, who turned out to be capable of nearly anything once shown at once, and Luther Kane's unexpected contribution of a full week's labor in exchange for Elias' help constructing a proper bedroom before Luther's wife arrived from Nebraska. The Langston house was 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above, exactly as planned, with a kitchen garden on the south side and a root cellar dug on the north, and a proper front porch that had not been in the original plan, but that Evelyn had suggested, and Elias had built without requiring much persuasion, running along the full front of the house with a bench on the east end that caught the morning sun. Moving from the tent to the house took most of one morning, and was accomplished with the help of Thomas, who carried everything with the effortless ease of youth, and Marta Wells, who brought a housewarming gift of 2 yards of curtain fabric in a pattern of small blue flowers that made Evelyn stand in the middle of the main room holding the fabric and blinking somewhat more than the dust in the air required. "Marta," she said. "Hush," said Marta, and set the fabric down on the new table, a proper table with 4 legs and a pine top that Elias had built himself in the evenings for the past 2 weeks, and began on a second gift, which was a tin of actual tea leaves, which was an extraordinary luxury. The first night they spent in the house, in the bedroom with the proper door that closed fully and the window that faced east to catch the dawn, Evelyn lay awake in the way she had on the first night in the tent, but for entirely different reasons. She listened to the house settle into itself, the small sounds of new wood, and she felt the solidity of the floor beneath the bed frame and the weight of real walls around her. And she thought about everything that had happened in the 52 days since she stepped off a stagecoach in Harrow Creek, Wyoming territory, and found a tent where a house was supposed to be. She had asked for a hammer and been given one without hesitation. She had built a door and a windbreak and helped raise 4 walls and pitched seed into good Wyoming earth, and she had made soup in a new kitchen and crouched in a garden and said "I love you" to a man with gray eyes and patient hands and the habit of knocking on door frames, and she was home. She reached across in the dark and found his hand and held it. He was not asleep. He turned his hand over and held hers back. "Good house," she said quietly. "Good house," he agreed. She slept better than she had since Missouri. Luther Kane's wife, whose name was Agnes, arrived from Nebraska in July on the freight wagon from Laramie, and she was a small, emphatic woman with a tremendous laugh and opinions on everything. And she and Evelyn liked each other immediately with the particular warmth of two women who recognize in each other a kindred practical intelligence. Agnes Kane arrived to find that her husband had built her a bedroom and planted a vegetable patch and improved the main room of their tent cabin with a floor of actual boards. And she took one slow look around and then turned to Luther and hugged him so hard that he turned red and his hat fell off. The four of them, Elias and Evelyn, Luther and Agnes, formed the kind of friendship that the frontier created and that cities rarely could, built on proximity and shared difficulty, and the knowledge that in hard weather or hard luck, each would be there for the others. They took Sunday meals together in rotation, which were loud and comfortable occasions, and they pooled knowledge and labor in the way of neighbors who understand that no one makes it alone on the high plains. Thomas Miller had by this time secured a small but real position for himself in Harrow Creek, working with Hiram Wells at the general store in exchange for a room and meals, and spending his free hours in Elias' woodshop. The second room downstairs had become a workshop rather than an office, housing the lathe that Elias had ordered from Cheyenne, developing a joinery skill that was quickly becoming exceptional. He built chairs with the kind of attention to proportion and detail that made them beautiful as well as functional, and when Hiram Wells displayed two of them in the store window, they were spoken for within a week. Elias encouraged this with the quiet warmth of a man who had found his own capacity and wanted to do the same for someone else. He found timber sources and talked to the land agent about what was possible for a young man of limited means wanting to establish a trade, and he lent Thomas tools and workspace without requiring anything in return. Evelyn watched this and thought that the man she had married was considerably more than she had understood from his letters, more generous than the letters had said, more capable of the kind of quiet loyalty that does not need to announce itself. She thought this often in those summer months, watching him work, watching him with Thomas and with Luther, and with the neighbors who came increasingly to Harrow Creek as the valley grew and the ranch claims multiplied. He was not a man who sought prominence, but he was the man people consulted when something needed thinking through, and he was unfailingly patient and honest in these consultations. She told him this one evening in late July, sitting on the front porch bench watching the sunset turn the mountain's extraordinary colors above the valley. "You have a reputation," she said, "as a man whose word is good." He looked somewhat uncomfortable with this. "I just tell the truth." "That is not as common as you think," she said. "My father used to say a man's word was the only real property he had," he said. "The land can be taken, the cattle can sicken, the house can burn. The word is the only thing that is entirely yours." He paused. He was not a perfect man by any means, but he was right about that. "What happened to him?" she asked. She had learned not to avoid the questions that mattered with him. He preferred directness to evasion. "He died in '64, he said. "In the war. He was too old for it, but he enlisted anyway because he felt he ought to, and he died of pneumonia in Virginia before he ever saw a battle." His voice was level. "I was 10. My mother managed the farm in Ohio until I was old enough to help, and then I helped, and when I was old enough she sold it and went to live with her sister in Cincinnati, and I joined the army, and that is the whole of it." "Not quite the whole of it," she said gently. He looked at her. "There is the part where you came to Wyoming and you put every cent into land and cattle and then spent a winter in a tent because you would not write to me and say there had been a delay," she said. "There is that part." He was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid if I wrote and said the house was not ready, you would not come." "I would have come," she said. "You could not have known that for certain," he said. "Yes," she said, "I could, because you had written honestly, because the letters were true." She turned to look at him fully. "Elias, I would have come for the honest letters, tent or not." He looked at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded, and she could see exactly what it felt like to be believed in his face, what it looked like when trust was given and received without performance. He took her hand on the bench and held it, and the mountains turned gold and then red, and then the color of old ash, and the first stars came up over the eastern plains, and they stayed on the porch until the night was fully dark because neither of them felt any need to be anywhere else. By August, Evelyn's kitchen garden was producing abundantly. The spinach had come and gone and been replaced by a second planting. The beans were climbing their poles with the enthusiastic determination of beans. The carrots were ready. The potatoes were nearly so, and the addition of purchased seedlings from a woman called Dora Finch, who came from a claim 2 valleys over, and who grew and sold, starts every spring from seeds she had been carrying and propagating across 3 territories over 15 years. Had added tomatoes and pepper plants and a sprawling squash vine that had taken over the southwest corner of the garden, with a territorial confidence that Evelyn admired. She had also, in a conversation with Agnes Kane that began as a discussion of the garden and ended 3 hours later with both women sitting on the Kane's porch with pencils and paper and a fundamental new plan, decided to expand. The plan was this: Harrow Creek was growing. New ranching families were arriving monthly. There was no school. Evelyn had grown up the daughter of a schoolteacher, and she had not, on examination, ever wanted to be anything else. The community needed a school, and she was qualified to teach one. And the territory of Wyoming was, remarkably, one of the few places in the United States that had in 1869 extended voting rights to women, and had since that time generally taken the position that a woman who was qualified to do a thing ought to be permitted to do it. She brought the plan to Elias on a Tuesday evening in the form of a written proposal, 2 pages in her careful hand, laying out the need. The existing student population she had counted 14 children within a reasonable distance of the town, the space required, the territorial requirements for school establishment, and the funding possibilities including territorial education funds and community subscription. She placed the 2 pages on the supper table after the dishes were cleared and sat down and waited. He read them carefully. She watched him read. When he was finished, he set the pages down and looked at her with the full attention. "You have already written to the Territorial Education Office," he said. "It was not a question." "I wrote last week," she said. "The response should come within a month." "And you have spoken to enough families to know 14 children is a firm count." 12 firm, 2 probable, she said. He nodded slowly. "The building," he said. "You will need a building. There is a possibility of using the space above the land office on weekdays," she said. "Ned Harper at the land office is willing if the community contributes to a wood stove for the upper room, which currently has no heat. And in the longer term, a dedicated building," she said, "would require either community funding or a land grant from the territory. I have included both possibilities in the proposal." He reread the 2nd page. He was quiet for a moment. "You have thought through everything," he said. "I am thorough," she said. "You are," he said, and he said it the way he said things that mattered, with weight. "This is a good plan. It is a necessary thing, and you are the right person to do it." He paused. "It will mean time away from the house." "The house runs itself now," she said. "The garden is established, the winter stores are underway, the accounts are in order. You know how to feed yourself, you did it for years." "I made terrible coffee," he said. "I will leave instructions," she said. He smiled. "What do you need from me?" She had not expected quite this speed. She had prepared arguments. She set the arguments aside and said simply, "Your support, and help with the wood stove situation, and possibly your opinion on which direction the schoolhouse ought to face when we get to that stage." "Southeast," he said immediately. "Morning light is best for reading." She looked at him. "My school in Ohio faced southeast," he said. "I always thought it was the best thing about it." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Southeast," she agreed. The response from the Territorial Education Office came in 3 weeks, not 4, and was positive in the cautious way of government correspondence. which was to say it confirmed eligibility and provided forms and listed requirements in detail while not exactly celebrating anything. Evelyn filled out every form with careful precision and returned them by the next mail. She began teaching in the upper room of the land office in September, with 12 confirmed students ranging in age from 6 to 13, 2 slates, 1 primer set borrowed from a family in Laramie who had older children, and a determination that made Hiram Wells, who happened to walk past the land office window on the first morning of school and heard the clear, steady sound of a woman teaching children to read, stop and stand with his hat in his hands for a moment and feel something uncomplicated and good about the state of the world. Elias brought the woodstove up the narrow stairs himself, with Thomas's help, and installed it in the pipe on the Saturday before school opened, and stayed to test the draw and confirm the room was warming properly. And Evelyn was arranging the slates on the borrowed desks and barely looked up because she was concentrating. And he watched her for a moment from the doorway, the set of her shoulders, the efficient grace of her hands, and felt, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, that he was the most fortunate man in Wyoming territory. He went home and made coffee, which was not as good as hers, and drank it looking at the mountains, and thought about the kind of life that was actually being possible here, board by board and seed by seed and child by child, and it was large and it was real and it was theirs. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was a hard one by any measure. November brought early snow that covered the valley in 2 feet and did not melt entirely until March. The temperatures dropped to extremes that froze the pump handle and required the horses to be brought into the lean-to attached to the barn that Elias and Thomas built in October, a structure of necessity born of watching the sky and knowing what it was saying. The house proved itself that winter. The walls were thick and the stove was good, and the root cellar, stocked with Evelyn's garden produce and the preserved meats and the dried beans and the pickled vegetables she had put up through September and October, kept them fed through the worst weeks when the freight did not come, and Harrow Creek was effectively isolated by snow. School did not stop. Evelyn held classes 3 days a week instead of 5, the days when the weather was passable, and she walked the quarter-mile to the land office in boots and a heavy wool coat that Elias insisted on treating with bear grease to make it water-resistant. And she taught with the stove cranked as high as it would go and the children in their coats until the room warmed enough to take them off. 2 children came from the claim farthest out, the children of a family named Beaumont who had a place nearly 2 miles away. And on the worst days, Elias appeared at the land office at the end of the school day with the wagon and drove them home across the snow, because their father had a bad leg from a winter accident 2 years previous and could not always make the trip himself. He did this without being asked and without particular discussion, and when Evelyn found out through Agnes Kane's network of frontier information, she said nothing to him directly about it for 3 days, and then on the evening of the 3rd day, she crossed the main room to where he was sitting by the stove with a mending project and sat beside him and put her head on his shoulder without preamble. He set the mending down and put his arm around her. "Agnes told you about the Beaumont children," he said. "Yes," she said. "I did not want to make a production of it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I am not making a production of it." She was quiet for a moment. "You are a good man, Elias Langston." "I am trying to be," he said. "You are succeeding," she said firmly. "That is a factual statement, not a compliment, so you do not need to look uncomfortable." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from his chest, the kind she had worked to earn all autumn and was now the most normal and regular sound of her days, and pulled her closer. And outside the Wyoming winter performed its worst against the windows and was thoroughly ignored. In February, during the deepest cold, Evelyn discovered she was expecting a child. She was not surprised exactly, but she was awed, the way a person is awed by something they understood in theory and now confronted in reality. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she told Elias, not out of fear of his reaction, but because she wanted to fully understand it herself first, wanted to sit with the weight of it and be certain of her own steadiness. She told him on a Sunday morning before the stove was properly lit in the gray winter light with snow on the windows and the house silent around them. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I am well," she said. "Are you frightened?" She considered this honestly. "Some," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, which was the right answer, and she was glad of it. "Good," she said. "I would not trust a man who was not." He crossed the room and held her with both arms carefully, as though she was both precious and entirely capable of standing on her own, which she was and which he understood, and she felt both of these things in the way he held her and was grateful for both. "Everything will be all right," he said into her hair. "I know," she said, and meant it. "But thank you for saying it." Agnes Kane, who had raised 3 children in Nebraska and had the authority of experience, became Evelyn's practical guide through the pregnancy with a thoroughness and lack of sentimentality that Evelyn found enormously reassuring. There was a woman in Laramie who served as midwife and who came to Harrow Creek for births, a capable and steady woman named Clara Dunbar, and Agnes had already written to her before Evelyn had quite finished telling anyone the news. The school kept going. Evelyn taught through the spring, through the whole of her pregnancy, and when some of the parents, 2 families, new to the valley and uncertain, expressed to Hiram Wells their reservations about a visibly pregnant woman instructing their children, Marta Wells told them with some heat that they could either let their children learn from the finest teacher in 3 counties or explain to those children in 20 years why they had not, and the matter was resolved. The territory of Wyoming, which had been first to grant women the vote, and had women jurors and women in public office before most of the country had acknowledged such a thing was possible, was not entirely unprepared for a schoolteacher who continued her work through a pregnancy. It was not entirely comfortable with it either, but the community of Harrow Creek had by now formed itself around the particular character of its residents, and those residents had largely decided that Evelyn Langston was an asset to the valley, and assets were not to be interfered with on theoretical grounds. The Territorial Education Office, when they sent their annual visit and assessment in April, were so impressed with the school's progress. 14 students now, 2 slates per student, a proper primer set purchased through a subscription that Evelyn had organized in February, and literacy rates that were measurably higher than the same children had registered a year before, that the visiting assessor stayed 2 hours past his scheduled time and wrote a report that resulted, 3 months later, in a formal territory grant for the construction of a dedicated schoolhouse, southeast-facing. Elias and Thomas built it in June and July, and it was a fine, clean building with 4 windows and proper benches, and a blackboard that Thomas made himself from boards coated with a mixture of plaster and lampblack that produced a surface as good as anything ordered from a catalog. He signed the back of the blackboard in small letters, Thomas W. Miller, Harrow Creek, WI, June 1883, and then he looked slightly embarrassed about it, and Evelyn told him he should be proud, and Elias said it was the best blackboard he had ever seen, which Thomas seemed to regard as one of the finer things anyone had said to him. The baby came in August. Clara Dunbar arrived from Laramie 3 days before, because Evelyn had read everything available on the subject of labor and delivery, and had written to Clara with enough clinical precision about the due date that Clara trusted the calculation and arrived early. This was fortunate, because the baby came 2 days after Clara arrived and the labor was hard and long, 17 hours, and at the end of it Evelyn was exhausted in a way that went to the bone, and Elias, who had been sent out of the room at the beginning and had spent the hours on the front porch bench in a state of sustained dread, heard the baby cry. It was a boy. He was red and furious-looking and weighed a substantial amount and had, when he eventually calmed from the fury of arrival, his father's gray eyes and his mother's copper-tinged hair, a combination that Clara Dunbar said she had never seen before, and that was, she added, extremely handsome for a 2-hour-old person. They named him James Edward Langston, for both their fathers, and he was placed in the cradle that Elias had built in February during the deep cold, and that had sat in the corner of the bedroom for 6 months waiting for its purpose. Elias sat on the edge of the bed holding his son for the first time with the same hands that had built the house, and set the fence posts, and held the plow and driven the nails. And he held this small and furious and impossibly new person, as if he were the most important thing those hands had ever touched, which he was, and looked at Evelyn, who was exhausted and radiant and watching him with the clear brown eyes that missed nothing. "Hello, James," Elias said to the baby very quietly, and the baby opened his gray eyes and seemed to consider this. "He looks skeptical," Evelyn said. "Sensible," Elias said. "He is new to everything. Skepticism is appropriate." She laughed, which was not quite comfortable with the exhaustion, and reached out her hand, and he took it. "Thank you," he said, and meant the entirety of things. "You helped," she said. "Not as much as you did," he said, looking at her steadily. "No," she agreed, "you did not." But she was smiling when she said it. The following years in Harrow Creek, Wyoming Territory, were years of building and rooting and growing in the way of good places when good people take hold of them. The schoolhouse opened in September of 1883 with 16 students and Evelyn at the front of the room with chalk on her hands, and the complete attention of 16 young people who knew a real teacher when they sat across from one. The school's reputation spread through the valley and into the neighboring claims, and families made decisions about where to settle based partly on the presence of a school worth settling near. Thomas Miller established a woodworking shop in a building adjacent to the general store in 1884, and the furniture he produced was good enough that orders came from Laramie and eventually from Cheyenne, and he hired a boy from one of the new ranch families to help him, and Evelyn watched all of this with the particular satisfaction of someone who had had the privilege of watching a person find out who they were. He came to supper every Sunday as a matter of established practice, and he was the person James Langston most admired in the world by the age of 2, largely because Thomas would build him small wooden animals with moving parts, which was unfair competition for any other adult to face. Luther Kane's wife Agnes had a daughter in the fall of 1883, a loud and decisive person named Harriet Agnes Kane, who was, from the first hour of her life, clearly going to be a source of either tremendous energy or tremendous chaos, and possibly both simultaneously, and who regarded the Langston household as an extension of her own from approximately the age she could walk there. Elias expanded the cattle operation in 1884, purchasing 40 additional head in a partnership with Luther that made both operations larger and more viable. And by 1885, the Langston Ranch had a reputation in the valley for the quality of its stock and the fairness of its dealings. He hired 2 cowhands, men from the south of the territory who came with recommendations and proved them true, and built a bunkhouse off the far side of the barn, and the claim that had been a single-wall tent and a half-built frame when Evelyn stepped off the stagecoach was by 1885 a going concern. A real working ranch with a house and a garden and a barn and outbuildings, and 40 acres under fence. In the spring of 1885, Evelyn found that she was expecting again. This time she was not 2 days sitting with the knowledge. She told Elias the same evening, across the supper table, with James in his chair between them conducting an experiment with a piece of bread that had gone some time past eating. Elias looked up from his plate with the gray eyes entirely warm. "Are you well?" he asked, same as before, first question, always first question. "Perfectly," she said. "Eat your supper." He reached across James's bread experiment and touched her hand briefly and entirely, and she turned her hand over and held his for a moment. "Southeast facing," he said. She looked at him. "I beg your pardon. The room," he said. "For the baby, the one we have been using for storage, it faces southeast. Morning light is best." He looked at her with entirely open gray eyes. "I have been thinking about expanding it for a year." She felt her throat tighten in the way it did when he surprised her, which he continued to do regularly 3 years into their marriage. "When did you start thinking about it?" she asked. "February," he said. "When you got the quilts out of the trunk in there, and I started wondering why we were storing things in a room that could be something else." February, she said, was very early thinking. "I like to plan ahead," he said, and went back to his supper with the expression of a man who is content, deeply and entirely content. And she looked at him across the table and at James between them, who had abandoned the bread experiment in favor of looking at both his parents with wide gray eyes that observed everything and missed nothing. And she felt the weight of her life as she had built it, solid and warm and completely hers. The baby was a girl this time, born in November of 1885, with a shock of dark hair like her father's and brown eyes like her mother's, and a disposition of such startling serenity that Clara Dunbar, delivering her second Langston child, said she had never seen a new person so thoroughly unconcerned with her own arrival. They named her Margaret Elias Langston, and she was, from the beginning, a person who observed before she acted and who thought through things carefully before she spoke, which made her entirely different from her brother James, who acted enthusiastically and thought about it after, and which made the two of them, by the time Margaret was old enough to walk, an extraordinarily effective combination. By 1886, Harrow Creek had become a real town. It had 200 residents, a church of its own with a resident minister, a proper hotel with 6 rooms, a blacksmith shop, and a second general store. Thomas Miller's woodshop had become the largest employer in town after the ranches. The school had expanded, and Evelyn now had 23 students, and had written to the Territorial Education Office requesting a second teacher, a request that was granted in the spring of 1887 in the form of a young man named David Park, recently graduated from the normal school in Laramie, who was nervous and earnest and very good at arithmetic, which meant that Evelyn, who was excellent at everything else, could divide the students into groups and serve them all better. Evelyn and Elias, on a warm evening in the summer of 1887, sat on the front porch bench that had been the first piece of furniture built for the house, and that had weathered 5 Wyoming winters and was now worn smooth and comfortable in all the right places, and looked at the valley below, where the lights of Harrow Creek were visible in the early dark, more lights than there had ever been. James, 5 years old and apparently incapable of being still, was running in the yard below the porch with Harriet Kane, who was 3 and equally incapable, in some form of pursuit game that had no clear rules but enormous energy. Margaret, 18 months, was on Evelyn's lap, watching the stars appear with serious brown eyes. "It is different from how I imagined it would be," Evelyn said. "The valley," Elias said. "Everything," she said. "All of it. It is better than I imagined it." He was quiet for a moment, watching James and Harriet negotiate some territorial dispute in the yard below with the complete seriousness of children conducting important business. "When you got off that stagecoach," he said. "Yes." "What did you think when you saw the tent?" She smiled. She had told this story before to Agnes, to Marta, but he had never asked it directly. "I thought," she said, "that I had 2 choices. I could get back on the stagecoach, which was already leaving, so that option was already gone, or I could ask for a hammer." He laughed, the good solid laugh from his chest that she had worked to earn, and that was now the most comfortable sound in her days. "What made you think of a hammer?" he said. "My father," she said. "He always said that if something is broken, you find the tool and you fix it. And the tent was not what I had been told to expect, and so I decided it was broken, in a manner of speaking, and I asked for the tool." He shook his head slowly. "And I gave you the hammer." "Without hesitation," she said. "That was the thing that decided it." He looked at her. "The hammer." "You gave it to me without hesitation," she said. "No questions about what I intended, no taking it back to show me how it ought to be done. Just, here is the hammer. What do you need next?" She looked at him steadily. "That told me everything I needed to know about you." Margaret made a soft sound and reached up and patted Evelyn's chin with a small, decisive hand, the way she patted things that she considered sufficiently examined and could now file away. Evelyn caught the small hand and kissed the knuckles, and Elias watched this with the look that had been on his face since the morning of Margaret's birth, and showed no signs of leaving. "I think about that morning a great deal," he said. "Which morning?" "The morning you arrived," he said. "The morning you asked for the hammer. I thought that morning I thought something that I did not say for a long time afterward." She looked at him. "What did you think?" "I thought," he said, "that if a woman steps off a stagecoach and finds a tent where a house was supposed to be and asks for a hammer, I am going to love her for the rest of my life." He said this with the same level plainness with which he said all true things, not dressed up, not performed. "I thought it before noon," he said. "I thought it before we finished the door." She was quiet for a long moment. The stars were fully up now, the great wheel of the Wyoming sky turning overhead, and in the yard below James and Harriet were conducting what appeared to be a trial, with James as judge and Harriet as both plaintiff and defendant, a situation she seemed to find entirely reasonable. Margaret had fallen asleep on Evelyn's lap with her small hand still loosely curled. "Before noon," Evelyn said. "Before noon," he confirmed. "I was significantly behind," she said. "I did not admit it to myself until the spinach." "The spinach," he said, smiling. "The first spinach coming up," she said. "In the garden, when you touched the soil next to it." She paused. "I thought if a man can be that careful with something that small, he can be trusted with everything." He reached over and took her hand on the bench, the one that was not holding the sleeping child, and held it as he had held it on 100 evenings and would hold it on 10,000 more. "We should plant more spinach," he said. "We should," she agreed. Below, James declared a verdict in the trial, and Harriet immediately appealed it, loudly and with great legal argument, and the Wyoming night continued its ancient business above them, unhurried and immense. And Evelyn Langston sat on the porch of the house she had helped to build in the town she had helped to grow, with her husband's hand warm around hers and her daughter sleeping across her lap and her son conducting frontier justice in the yard below. And the mountains in the dark were exactly as enormous as they had been on the day she arrived with a carpet bag and $43, and the deep, unarguable knowledge that the ground was closer than it appeared. It was. It had been all along. In the years that followed, Harrow Creek continued to grow, and the school became what Evelyn had always known it could be, a real institution, a thing that shaped the valley and the lives of the children in it. And some of those children grew up to become people of consequence, a doctor in Laramie, a judge in Cheyenne, a woman who taught school in 3 territories and wrote about education in a paper that was read as far east as New York. And they carried the school's mark, which was also Evelyn's mark, with them. Thomas Miller, in 1889, the year Wyoming became a state, built the finest piece of furniture Harrow Creek had ever seen. A desk for the schoolhouse, made of walnut with inlaid oak borders, presented to Evelyn at the schoolhouse door on the first day of the school year, and on the back of the top drawer he had written, in small, careful letters, for Mrs. Langston, who knew what a hammer was for. Harrow Creek, Wyoming, 1889. She kept the desk for the rest of her teaching life, which was long, and every student who sat across it in the years that followed ran their fingers at some point along the carved walnut edge and felt the quality of it, the solidity, the thing made to last. Elias built a bigger porch the spring of 1889 to mark statehood and the completion of a decade of ranch work that had turned 40 head of cattle into one of the finest small herds in the county, and because the existing bench was wearing out and he intended to replace it with something better, which he did. A proper bench with a back, made of oak, with a slight pitch to the seat that caught the evening light exactly right. They sat on it the evening Wyoming became a state, Elias and Evelyn, with James 7 and Margaret 3 and the valley below full of lights and the distant sound of celebration from the Copper Spur Saloon, and she put her head on his shoulder because it was her preferred position, and he put his arm around her because it was his, and they looked at the mountains in the long summer evening light. "A decade," he said. "Nearly," she said. "7 years and a few months." "From the tent," he said. "From the tent," she said. She felt him laugh quietly, the chest sound of it, and turned to look at him. And his face in the evening light was the face she had learned the way you learn a landscape. Every line and angle, every expression, every particular quality of the gray eyes that had first watched her from across a dusty street in the spring of 1882, braced and hopeful and trying not to show either. They were not braced now. They were entirely open, entirely present, and they were looking at her the same way they had looked at the spinach that April morning, with that careful attention that understood the small and vital thing in front of it. "I love you," he said. Same plainness, same weight. 11 years of it had not worn it down. "I love you," she said, and meant it in the same complete and bone-deep and practical way she had always meant it, the way she had meant it in the kitchen garden and in the tent on the cold winter nights, and in the schoolroom and across the supper table, and every ordinary, extraordinary day of this life they had built together from a tent and a hammer, and the particular grace of choosing honestly. Behind them, James put Margaret to bed with only moderate negotiation, and the stars came up over the new state of Wyoming, and somewhere in the valley a coyote called and was answered, and the Langston house stood solid on its foundation with its southeast-facing windows catching what light remained, and would stand there still when the children were grown and gone and come back again. And their children's children would sit on the oak bench in the summer evenings and hear the story of the tent and the hammer and the woman who stepped off a stagecoach in April of 1882, ready to build whatever needed building. And in the telling, that story would always be a love story, which was exactly what it was from before noon on the very first day, and which it remained through every season of that long Wyoming life, without reservation and without end.